Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, where I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas.
Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. I am George Socha, Senior Vice President of Brand Awareness at Reveal. Each Friday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, I host an episode of eDiscovery Leaders Live where I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. Past episodes are available on the Reveal website. Go to revealdata.com, select Resources, then select eDiscovery Leaders Live. My guests this week are Michelle Six and Dan Raffle of Kirkland and Ellis. Michelle is a partner in Kirkland's New York office, chair of the firm-wide Electronic Discovery Committee, leading the firm's e-discovery efforts. She advises clients in the US, Europe, and Asia on strategic electronic discovery considerations, data protection, and privacy issues. Dan is Associate Director of Litigation Technology with experience previously at Bingham McCutcheon and Fast Track Litigation Support. Between them, they work on some of the most complex and demanding e-discovery challenges that their clients face, including with Michelle, one of the largest, if not the largest, MDLs ever. Michelle, Dan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Well, this week we are going to talk about the art of negotiating TAR agreements, something that may not be near and dear to your hearts, but something that you certainly need to deal with regularly. I'm going to throw it over to you. Where would you like to start in all of that?
I'm happy to start. I think TAR agreements are still something that change quite a bit, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, what kind of case you have, what kind of data your client is dealing with. In some cases, it may not always be appropriate or necessary to have a TAR agreement, right? It might be something that you can deal with in an ESI stipulation. But sometimes, given the interest in the process by both sides, and I think an interest in the right amount of transparency and cooperation, it is sometimes really, really helpful to have a protocol both parties have signed off on that's guiding the process and sort of setting expectations and also setting some goalposts, right? So to help sort of cabin our obligations, make sure we're doing stuff that is reasonable and proportional to the needs of the case. And also not something that's going to be challenged down the road.
And speaking from the sort of non-attorney litigation and technology professional or sort of provider side, it's important to know the rules of the road and what you can and can't do in a given matter. So looking at an ESI order or asking if one exists and making sure before you start volunteering TAR 1 or TAR 2 or even 3 inclusive email review using threading, make sure that that's permitted under the order.
What are some of the major pitfalls that people run into as they try to negotiate TAR agreements?
I'm happy to take that first, Dan. I think the biggest pitfall for me personally, I'll speak for myself, is that there is sort of no best practice or one way to do things. I've negotiated a TAR order in one matter that's sort of bubbled back up in other cases where plaintiffs have used it, sort of pointed to it and said, hey, this is what we want to do here. The agreements you entered into in that case are exactly what we want here. And I have to say, no dice. Not that there was anything wrong with what was negotiated for that other matter, but because this matter has different considerations, different data sets, different scope. And the processes that were reasonable and manageable for that matter may not be the processes that are reasonable and manageable for this one. So when folks are interested in using TAR, negotiating a protocol, I usually get the question, can I see some precedent, right? It's every lawyer's favorite thing. Like, what's the best precedent? What do we have here? Where has this been successful? And it can be a little frustrating to sort of say, I can send you TAR orders that have been negotiated successfully and entered in various cases. They may or may not have any bearing on how you want to proceed here based on the type of TAR that you want to use, the tool that you're planning to use, the way you're planning to structure that tool and the review, and then the strategy behind the review and the strategy that is negotiated, between a client and counsel as to how they want to meet their deadlines, what their reasonable efforts need to look like. So that can be very challenging. It's not as simple as sort of looking to what somebody else did successfully in a case and saying, oh, I'll just bring that over here, leverage that exact process here. It can be a lot more challenging than that.
So Dan, one of the things that I think often comes up with TAR protocols is that one side or the other wants to lay out all of the technical requirements and obligations in excruciating detail. What's your take on that?
I think it depends. I think providing some level of detail is important. I mean, it depends on which type of protocol too. And I think I'd actually maybe step back for a second and because I have people jumping ahead to, hey, we want to use TAR. Sometimes search terms work fine and they're easy to negotiate and it's okay. But even deciding between TAR 1 and TAR 2 and what makes the most sense is you want to do a little sampling if you can, sort of figure out what the landscape looks like before. So you're going in informed as much as possible. Writing an ESI order in a vacuum, if you don't know sort of what the richness of the population is, sort of, how many documents in general there are, how complicated privilege is going to be, all those things sort of bear in what we're going to do. But I think from the technical perspective, having to spend a lot of time in meet and confer discussing all the intricacies of the process is a thing that sort of makes people not want to do it, in my experience. Like, they're just like, oh, it's too hard to negotiate. It's difficult to pursue, or they're going to ask us, and Michelle will comment on this, show all the non-responsive documents or training sets or seed sets, and those tend to be sort of non-starter requests when we see them.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that a little bit. Dan raises a really good point in that probably the first and most important thing to think about if you're planning to negotiate a TAR protocol is whether you need to use TAR, whether TAR is the right thing for your data set. I think TAR at its best is a process that can be utilized and leveraged to save on time, to save on cost, to hopefully build a more efficient and accurate review. But it may not always be necessary, depending on what your obligations look like in a matter. You may want to use it to prioritize review of certain documents, but not actually use it to cull any documents out. You may want to use search terms and do TAR as well. There has to be a really bespoke element of looking at your case, figuring out what is going to be best for you and your client, and then figuring out from there how much of it you need to or want to codify in a stipulation.
And it's probably good to make clear, when we're talking about a TAR protocol or order, that's when we're using it to cull documents, to not review certain material. If, we use active learning and we have Brainspace in-house that we sort of turn on almost every matter for prioritization and QC. And we don't have to disclose that. That's just sorting. That's the way I like to, in layman's terms, we just sort by relevance instead of sorting by some other field.
One of the assertions I hear from time to time, and this goes back, I forget which of you mentioned this, but it is that in order to use tar effectively, you cannot first have used search terms, and by extension, any protocol that includes both the use of search terms and the use of tar is a fatally flawed protocol. I suspect you are not of that view.
I'm just envisioning the emails I'm going to get from people. So I think it depends, right?
Mm-hmm.
I understand that the statisticians and the scientists and people who are much smarter than me about data tend to believe in a system that is trained in the absence of search terms, a system that is trained up against the full corpus of collected data. I think that if you are going to fight some fights with the opposing party in your matter, if you have to fight about search terms and fight over a tar protocol, that's 2 fights. And maybe if you aren't using search terms, you're down to one fight. If you have to fight at all, which we never, we hope to never fight. But for me, especially in matters where we are collecting, terabytes and terabytes of data, I tend to like culling that data down by search terms first. It has been an efficient and effective process for me, but again, it really does depend on your data set, on what your obligations look like, and where you think you're going to be able to best meet your reasonable obligations.
Are there cost implications to one approach versus the other?
I think it depends on the tool that you're using, would be my guess. If you have 20 million documents and you're using an iterative training model, I don't think we necessarily know or could say 100% whether getting that universe down to 2 million documents first using search terms and then trying to train the model from that would ultimately yield a review population that wound up being more or less than if we just took the 20 million universe and started training the model from that. I bet there are lots of people who know this stuff and, back and forth, who would say it absolutely will. It will be like a more limited burden if you don't use the search terms. The non-statistician kind of lawyer side of my head is like, oh, but if we cull it down from 20 million to 2 million first, all the better for us. So I would not venture into the science and math and engineering part of the algorithmic process because I'm not smart enough. But I do think there is not one way to do it, right? There are ways. I've entered into protocols where we have used search terms first, and entered into protocols where we haven't.
And I would say, if you have 20 million documents with a sub 1% richness, sort of very few relevant documents in there. Cal works on that. You probably can find your relevant documents, but all the sampling becomes a lot more difficult because you're really trying to find needles in an enormous haystack. And so adding broad search terms at the beginning, both just to cut the set down to a manageable size, and then use Cal, you sort of get better sampling, and you can kind of know, using air quotes, using statistics a little bit more about what you missed, what you found, rather than trying to do that on a huge amount of data that's mostly not relevant.
Some folks like to bake numbers into their protocols, their tar protocols. Others prefer to avoid that. So by that I mean folks who say that you must achieve a certain rate of precision or a certain rate of recall or a certain confidence level. What's your take on that? And how that plays out when you're negotiating protocols?
So, sometimes you're going to get asked by the other side to bake those numbers in. Other times, depending on how much candor you want to reveal in your process, or how much you want to discuss the process, it may be that the thing that makes the most sense is to not bake in any numbers. To say, I don't know when the responsiveness rate is going to fall off a cliff. And so for me to put in, that we're not going to review under 65 or 70 or whatever is too arbitrary. And may or may not ultimately be what the system is telling us, and is not the right place to sort of stop and sample, do an illusion test, or otherwise sample those bottom rank documents. I think, again, that when you're baking numbers in, it is so important for the lawyers to consult with the technical folks, the vendor, whoever is engaging and helping the attorneys with the technical side of the process. The most important thing is to make sure that what you are negotiating is something that can be done. I know I've definitely gotten very creative and written stuff down and sent it to Dan and said, hey, how does this work for a protocol? And he has to look at it and say, Michelle, no, this is not how we do it. This isn't going to validate anything in the way that you think it is. So it's just very, very important for lawyers not to go rogue, but to actually make sure that they're consulting with and getting the advice and counsel of people who understand the back-end processes.
So flip side for you, Dan, how do you help ensure that the lawyers don't go rogue?
You ask a lot of questions about what they're trying to do and the strategy and the data set. Doing that initial sampling so that you can help them decide between TAR 1 and TAR 2. So with TAR 1, where there's a control set and you are sampling is baked into the process, I tend to see numbers disclosed more. You're setting a recall goal at the beginning. That seems to be more agreed. Cal is a lot more sort of loose, and I think discussing your process, and a lot of times I do see language the parties will meet and confer about sort of when to wrap up review, and it depends on the parties and how formalized they want to make things, but helping them decide. And we do this internally on investigations, even when we're not producing documents, is sort of, how do we know when we're done? How do you know when to stop review? A lot of folks will say, well, when you run out of responsive documents, it's well, there's always probably some in there. And it's what the diminishing return is. How do you know if you really not missed anything significant? So when we're looking at an illusion test, is it a marginally responsive document, or is it oh, this moves the needle and this is new and we have to go look at more stuff? So that's the kind of thinking we do, and sort of when we're discussing sort of measures of completion, looking at the daily responsive rate and sort of depth to find the next responsive document and sort of how much money that's going to cost. That's all the stuff that sort of weighs into helping them make those decisions.
What I find so interesting, though, about this entire conversation, because it is we have these conversations on every case where we sort of think about, do we want to use TAR? And if we do, what kind of TAR are we going to use? How are we going to negotiate that? There seems to be this sense from opposing parties, in my experience at least, that if you're doing TAR, there is this obligation to just open kimono, reveal everything. And I'm always sort of why do I owe you more here than I owe you if I'm running search terms, right? We do some validation. We test our search terms. We tend to, oftentimes, if there's no privilege consideration, we share our search term hit reports, to make sure that there's been some sort of negotiation and both sides can feel like the search terms are appropriate in scope. But there's something about TAR that I think still freaks people out in the fact that they, when you sort of say well, how does it work? And there's all sorts of wonderful technical explanations about how it works, but then it's still, you're sort of left with that and it's an algorithm that's been trained. And I think people are still sort of well, but what, computers can be wrong, computers can be broken, and of course human beings can be wrong and human beings can be broken too. But I do find it fascinating that in my negotiations to date, people do want to demand to bake in numbers, or they do want to demand some sort of standardized rubric or metrics, no matter, even if I sort of say, well, hey, the kind of TAR that we're doing, that's not a particularly effective methodology for understanding our process. it is just interesting to me that there seems to be a sense that they're entitled to know everything, which they wouldn't necessarily be, I think, as vigorous about if we were just doing a more traditional linear review based on terms.
I don't know if you've been in the position to pursue this with the other side, but if you have you asked, and have you been able to essentially ask them, why do you want to hold me to this higher standard with TAR than with search terms? If you've had the chance to ask that question, what's the response been?
In a couple of negotiations, I've sort of been a little taken aback, I think, and said, why would I tell you that? I wouldn't tell you that in any other world of more traditional document review. And I think that there is this fear that with a model that gets trained inaccurately, there could be sort of swaths of responsive stuff that would never bubble up into the review because of sort of one bad call made early on by a reviewing attorney. And that for whatever reason, even though I don't necessarily have any reason to think this is true, but there's a sense of that is something that is more dire than a missed call if you have a universe that is populated by search terms. Right, that like one missed call or two missed calls early on in a search term-based review process isn't going to, skew your entire thing off course. Whereas potentially in this, a training model, one bad call or one wrong call could do that.
One bad search term wouldn't do that.
Of course, I don't think it is an argument that's particularly. Based in any science. I think it's sort of just based in general human fear and lack of understanding about how the technology works, which is why I think for me, the most important thing, that I like to think about early on is how am I validating my process, right? If someone challenges my process, what steps do I have to show the court and the opposing party, but really mostly the court, that what I did is defensible, that we sort of had checks in place to see if we were veering wildly off course, and we have enough sort of checks and balances in place to feel confident that we're on course.
Two areas that I gather can be especially contentious have to do with threading and privilege. Do you want to take on either one of those? Either of you?
I want to take on neither. Yes, they can be. They are, I think, getting increasingly contentious, as a matter of fact. And again, I think it may be because there is a concern that those processes are leaving folks feeling like they're not getting what they are entitled to get in the course of discovery. I do not think that those concerns are well-founded. I don't think that by leveraging email threading, you are inherently, leaving relevant stuff on the cutting room floor. If anything, I think it's the opposite. I think you are sort of making sure that your potentially relevant universe is intact and together. And easier to review because it has been sort of consolidated in a way that requires, makes the story a little bit easier to tell, I think. But there is concern that I have heard, certainly from the plaintiff's bar, and occasionally from the judiciary, that threading will inherently sort of lose something that otherwise should have been reviewed. And then on the privilege side, right, there is a concern that by logging on your privilege log only the sort of top level last in time email on a thread, you may be missing some non-privileged material that should be produced, right? That in some way in threading, you are going to have a missed privilege call or an inaccurate privilege call in terms of something gets withheld entirely that should perhaps only be redacted. I don't think either of those concerns are valid I don't mean to call those concerns invalid. I know that people feel them very profoundly, but I think with the right threading tool and transparency about that tool and the right type of privilege review, I don't see why threading should inherently invalidate the accuracy of a relevancy review or the accuracy of a privilege logging process.
Dan, go ahead, Dan.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say from the technical perspective, and I see, in orders, see folks requesting, well, yeah, fine, review the inclusives, but then produce all of the lesser emails or log all of the lesser emails. And, the state of threading technology right now is the threading is very good at rolling up things and finding inclusives, but there can be multiple inclusives in a chain, many branches of a chain, and unwinding a branch of a chain that's responsive or unwinding a branch that's privileged isn't really built into that. Like it's the whole all or nothing. And when you've reviewed a branch, or a thread, we build a lot of, if we're doing individual messages, we build a lot of consistency checks. It's a lot of work. So threading, yields a large amount of sort of data reduction, but also like on the QC side where, the Kirkland attorneys are focused, sort of making sure that things are coded consistently throughout the thread. And that sort of just builds that work right back in. So some of those requests, from my perspective, it's like, well, there's not really a point in doing it if you have to then blow everything up and review it anyway, because it's not like you can just push a button and unwind it that easily.
And I candidly also don't understand, again, why the threading presents this issue in a way that a regular linear document by document unthreaded process wouldn't present also. That's the part that I'm always sort of challenged by. It says, well, you have to, log every email separately that's included in the thread. Why? If it's all privileged, if the entire email is privileged, I'm going to log the top one. And if you have questions about the, we can give you additional metadata from the preceding emails in the thread. But why would I inherently do something different for a thread that's entirely privileged than I would for just a lengthy email chain that's privileged, right? We've all seen non-threaded emails that have been as long or longer as a threaded email. So this sort of sense that in threading, something is going to get lost, something is going to be mistaken, it has not been my experience in the course of a threaded review. If anything, I found that the accuracy and the privilege and relevance calls are more consistent in a threaded process.
So first Dan, and then Michelle. For those, so closing thoughts. For those people who are hoping to successfully negotiate TAR agreements, what are the 1, 2, or 3, whatever you want, most important things they should be thinking about or doing? So Dan, you first, and then Michelle.
I would say know your data. To the extent you can, get data into an ECA workspace or somewhere and do some testing. So before you burn time negotiating, an order, like make sure that you kind of know what you want to get and what the chances are of success. Talk to experts, and then do some sampling if you can. So that goes for almost everything. It's like other parts of an ESI order. If you're talking about preservation, make sure you talk to IT first before you decide what you can preserve. So kind of that's a good broad rule that covers most things with ESI orders.
Michelle?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I'm going to echo what Dan said. First, decide if TAR is right for your matter, for your case, for your project. If it is, figure out if you want to use it for prioritization of review or if you want to actually use it as a methodology to eliminate the need to review documents. I would say don't decide to do the latter without some level of disclosure. We have seen case law as recently as I think the end of last year, where folks decided to use TAR not for prioritization, but for actual culling of documents, did not disclose to the other side that they were doing that. And the judge was not happy with that. So if you plan to use it to cull your documents and eliminate the need for review of documents, I think you do need some level of disclosure. But I would also point out that I don't know that you need the amount of disclosure that an opposing party might demand from you, or make it sound like you absolutely have to share. I think that what gets shared should be a strategic decision and should be bespoke to the needs of your case.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Dan. Dan is Associate Director, Litigation Technology, and Michelle is a partner at Kirkland and Ellis. I am George Socha. This has been eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. Thank you all for joining us today. Please join us again next Friday when our guest will be Kevin Flynn of Moray. Dan, Michelle, thanks so much.
Thank you.